Canada is spending $800 million on a town most Canadians have never heard of. It has no highway. It has no neighboring city. For nearly 2 full years, it was completely cut off from the rest of the country, accessible only by plane. At one point, it looked like it was simply going to disappear. And now, Russia is nervous about it. China is investing around it. And the global shipping industry is suddenly paying very close attention to 900 people living on the edge of a freezing bay in northern Manitoba. This is Churchill. And what is happening there right now is one of the most important and least reported geopolitical stories in the world. And yet, right now, the Canadian federal government is pouring over $800 million into this place. Cranes are working through Arctic fog. Engineers are redesigning a harbor. A railway that was left to rust is being rebuilt from the ground up. And quietly, very quietly, global shipping companies from Europe and Asia are beginning to pay very close attention. The town is called Churchill. And if the people betting on it are right, it won't be a forgotten outpost for much longer. It could become one of the most strategically important ports in the entire world. Not in 50 years, in less than a decade. Here's the thing that makes this story so extraordinary. Churchill's rise isn't happening because of a political decision or a corporate investment strategy. It's happening because of something much more powerful and much harder to stop. The planet is warming, the ice is melting, and the map of global trade is being redrawn in real time. Churchill just happens to sit at the exact point on that new map where everything converges. And Canada, a country that has spent decades being outmaneuvered by its own geography, may have finally found the one place where geography works entirely in its favor. To understand why Churchill matters so much, you first have to understand what Hudson Bay actually is. Most people think of it as just another body of cold Canadian water. But look at a map carefully. Hudson Bay is enormous. It covers more than 1.2 million square kilometers, making it larger than Germany and France combined. It stretches deep into the interior of North America, pushing south almost to the latitude of London, and through a narrow channel called Hudson Strait. It connects directly to the Atlantic Ocean. What that means geographically is almost impossible to overstate. Hudson Bay is essentially a hidden door into the heart of the continent. A ship leaving Hamburg or Rotterdam doesn't have to fight its way through the St. Lawrence Seaway, navigate the locks, and inch toward Montreal. It can enter through Hudson Strait, cut straight across the bay, and arrive at Churchill in as little as 7 days. The same journey to Montreal through the St. Lawrence takes closer to 2 weeks. That's not a minor difference. In the shipping industry, 7 days is an enormous competitive advantage. And Churchill has something else that no other Arctic port on the Canadian coastline possesses: a railway. The Hudson Bay Railway runs nearly 1,000 kilometers south from Churchill, all the way to Winnipeg, connecting directly into Canada's vast continental rail network. That means cargo arriving at Churchill from Europe doesn't just sit on the shore of Hudson Bay. It can move immediately into the agricultural heartland of the prairies, or onward to Ontario, or even down into the American Midwest. And cargo moving in the other direction, grain from Saskatchewan, minerals from northern Manitoba, manufactured goods from the industrial center of the country, can reach Churchill by rail and then sail directly to Europe without touching the congested ports of the St. Lawrence. That combination of deep-water Arctic access and continental rail connection is what makes Churchill genuinely unique. There is no other port in the Canadian North that has both, which is exactly why what happened to it in 2016 was so devastating, and why what is happening now is so significant. For most of its modern history, Churchill functioned as a grain terminal. Prairie farmers would ship wheat and canola by rail to Churchill during the brief summer window when Hudson Bay was navigable, and freighters would carry it across the Atlantic to European markets. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't strategic. It was just a modest piece of agricultural logistics infrastructure operating at the edge of the known world. Then the railway flooded. Spring melt in 2017 washed out large sections of the line, and the company that owned it, a short line operator called Omnitrax, decided the repair costs weren't worth it. They walked away. The railway stopped running, and just like that, the only land connection between Churchill and the rest of Canada was gone. The town was suddenly accessible only by air, which meant food prices tripled overnight, supplies ran short, and the future of the community went from uncertain to genuinely bleak. People started leaving, businesses started closing. It looked like Churchill was simply going to disappear, quietly and without much notice, the way remote Canadian outposts sometimes do. But here's what changed everything. While Churchill was struggling to survive, Canadian government analysts were quietly looking at data coming in from Hudson Bay. And what they were seeing was alarming in one sense and extraordinary in another. The bay was thawing. Not gradually, not over the course of a century. Faster than almost any climate model had predicted. The ice cover on Hudson Bay had already dropped by nearly 50% since 1980. The summer shipping season, which had historically run for only a couple of months, was stretching longer every year. And the projections for the early 2030s showed something that would have sounded like science fiction just a decade earlier. Hudson Bay could be navigable for the majority of the year. Not just for summer, for most of the year. That changed the entire calculation around Churchill, because a Churchill with a 3-month shipping window was a seasonal grain terminal. A Churchill with a 9 or 10-month shipping window was something else entirely. It was a year-round strategic port sitting at the entrance to the Arctic. In 2018, a consortium of Canadian investors stepped in, backed by significant federal support, and purchased Churchill's port and railway infrastructure for $117 million. The federal government then committed over $800 million more for a comprehensive upgrade program, deepening the harbor so it can handle larger modern vessels, rebuilding the flood-damaged sections of the railway, reinforcing the bridges along the line, installing cold-weather cargo handling systems capable of operating in extreme Arctic conditions. What had started as a rescue mission for a dying town was quietly transforming into something much bigger, a national strategy. And the reason for that strategy comes down to one simple and enormous economic reality. The Arctic is opening up, and whoever controls the infrastructure along the Arctic shipping routes is going to have an extraordinary amount of power over global trade in the decades ahead. Consider the numbers. A cargo ship traveling from Hamburg to Shanghai through the Northwest Passage covers roughly 15,000 kilometers. The same journey through the Suez Canal covers around 21,000 kilometers. That is 6,000 kilometers shorter. That translates to approximately 12 fewer days at sea. And on a single large voyage, that can mean savings of close to $500,000 in fuel alone. When you multiply that across thousands of voyages per year, the economics become impossible to ignore. By 2023, dozens of commercial vessels were already transiting the Northwest Passage, a number that would have been unthinkable 20 years ago. Thus, momentum is building every single summer. Shipping companies that once dismissed the Arctic as an interesting theoretical shortcut are now running serious feasibility studies and signing exploratory agreements. The question is no longer whether Arctic shipping becomes a major global trade route. The question is when. And the answer, based on current ice data, appears to be sooner than almost anyone expected. But here's the problem that Churchill solves. Arctic shipping, for all its promise, currently has almost no support infrastructure. Between the North Atlantic and the Bering Strait, there is no major deep-water port capable of handling large vessels, providing reliable refueling, offering maintenance facilities, or restocking supplies. Ships attempting the Northwest Passage are essentially sailing through one of the most remote stretches of ocean on Earth, with nowhere to stop if something goes wrong. That is not a sustainable model for serious commercial shipping. You can't build a global trade route on infrastructure that doesn't exist. Churchill changes that equation. Sitting on the western edge of Hudson Bay, with direct access to the shipping lanes of the emerging Northwest Passage and a rail connection running south into the continent, it is positioned to become exactly the kind of mid-route hub that Arctic shipping desperately needs. A place where ships can refuel, resupply, offload cargo for continental distribution, or pick up exports from the North American interior, the missing link. And as the ice retreats further north every year, that missing link becomes more valuable with every passing summer. There is another dimension to Churchill's importance that goes beyond trade economics, and it is arguably even more consequential: sovereignty. Canada claims the Northwest Passage as internal Canadian waters. It has held this position consistently for decades, but that claim is disputed. The United States, the European Union, and several other maritime nations argue that the Northwest Passage is an international strait, which under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea means foreign ships would have the right to transit it freely without asking Canadian permission or paying Canadian fees. The legal and geopolitical stakes of that dispute are enormous. If Canada's position prevails, it controls one of the most important shipping corridors in the world. If it doesn't, it loses that control entirely. And here's the critical point. In international law, sovereignty isn't just something you declare. It's something you demonstrate. You demonstrate it through presence, through activity, through control. A country that has a functioning port on Arctic waters, with Canadian workers, Canadian regulations, Canadian Coast Guard patrols operating out of it, and Canadian cargo moving through it, has a much stronger legal and political case for sovereignty than a country that simply draws a line on a map and says, "This is ours." Every ship that docks at Churchill, every ton of grain that moves through its harbor, every Coast Guard vessel that departs from its upgraded facilities is an act of sovereignty. It is Canada saying, in the most practical and undeniable terms possible, that these are Canadian waters, that Canada is here, and that Canada intends to stay. This matters enormously in the current geopolitical environment because Canada is not the only country that has noticed the Arctic is opening up. Russia has spent years militarizing its Arctic coastline, building new military bases, deploying icebreakers, and developing its own northern sea route along the Siberian coast as a competing Arctic trade corridor. China, which has no Arctic coastline of its own, has nonetheless declared itself a near-Arctic state and poured billions into what it calls the Polar Silk Road, investing in Arctic infrastructure, research stations, and shipping agreements across the region. Both countries are positioning aggressively for a future in which the Arctic is not a frozen wilderness, but a zone of intense strategic and commercial competition. Against that backdrop, Canada's investment in Churchill isn't just about port revenues and shipping fees. It's about making sure that when the Arctic becomes the next great arena of global power, Canada has a concrete, functioning presence there. Not just a claim on paper, a port, a railway, a community, a strategic outpost that can support naval patrols, facilitate surveillance, anchor Canadian authority over waters that Russia and China would very much like to see declared international. The federal government has committed over $2 billion to broader Arctic defense and surveillance initiatives, including new Arctic offshore patrol ships, improved satellite monitoring systems, and infrastructure centered around exactly the kind of hub that Churchill is being built to become. The Churchill Marine Observatory, which opened in 2021, is already tracking sea ice patterns, monitoring marine ecosystems, and measuring pollution risks in Hudson Bay. Research that will be essential for managing the environmental consequences of dramatically increased Arctic shipping traffic. Because there are real environmental stakes here that cannot be ignored. The same climate change that is opening up these shipping routes is also destabilizing the Arctic ecosystem in ways that are still not fully understood. More ships mean more risk of fuel spills in some of the most ecologically sensitive and difficult-to-reach waters on the planet. They mean disruption to the migration routes of narwhals, beluga whales, and polar bears. They mean noise pollution in an ocean that has been largely silent for most of human history. Canada's challenge is not just to build Churchill into a world-class port, but to do so in a way that doesn't destroy the very environment that makes Arctic sovereignty worth having in the first place. That is a genuinely difficult balance, and it will require sustained political will and serious scientific investment to get right. The economic impact on Churchill itself and the surrounding region is already beginning to be felt. Employment in the town has been rising since the railway investment began. The population, which had been shrinking for years, has stabilized and is starting to grow again. Young people are returning, drawn by jobs in port operations, rail maintenance, logistics, and support services. For the indigenous communities in the region, the Cree and Dene peoples who have lived along the shores of Hudson Bay for thousands of years, the development is bringing employment and business opportunities that have historically been scarce. Indigenous groups have been involved in the planning process, and the long-term agreements being developed are designed to ensure that the economic benefits of Churchill's rise are shared with the communities whose traditional territory surrounds it. Looking further out, the projections become remarkable. The federal government estimates that Churchill's development will generate $15 billion in economic activity over the next 20 years. European shipping companies are already in conversations about using Churchill as their primary North American gateway. Asian manufacturers are eyeing it as an alternative to the chronically congested ports of Vancouver and Prince Rupert on the Pacific coast. If even a fraction of the trade that analysts are projecting shifts to Arctic routes by 2050, and current ice data suggests that fraction could be substantial, Churchill's position at the entry point of Hudson Bay puts it directly in the path of one of the greatest commercial opportunities of the 21st century. And yet, for all of that, the most remarkable thing about Churchill's story might simply be this: a town that almost ceased to exist, a railway that almost stayed abandoned, a port that almost no one outside of Manitoba had thought about in decades. All of it sitting quietly on the shore of a bay that the world was too focused on warmer places to notice. And now the ice is retreating, the shipping lanes are opening, and suddenly the entire strategic logic of the Arctic is bending toward this tiny, resilient, improbable place. Sometimes geography rewards patience. Sometimes the most important location in the world is the one that had to wait the longest to be recognized for what it always was. Canada is betting $800 million, and considerably more beyond that, on the idea that Churchill's moment has finally arrived. Based on what the data is showing, and what the ice is doing, and what the shipping companies are calculating, that bet is looking less like a gamble every single year. Churchill isn't the future of global trade, not yet. But the future of global trade is moving in its direction. And in a world where the roots of commerce shift as the planet warms, the country that had the foresight to build a port at the right place on the right coast of the right ocean at the right moment in history is going to have something very few nations ever managed to achieve: the right piece of geography at exactly the right time. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Do you think Churchill can actually become a major global port? Or is the Arctic still too remote, too unpredictable, and too politically complicated to ever deliver on this kind of promise? Because the answer to that question might shape the next century of world trade in ways most people haven't even begun to imagine.